We live, Deb? That's live, Chair.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee held on Thursday, the 11th of February 2021, chaired by myself, Councillor Ahmed Boston. This meeting is being held in accordance with the local authorities and police and crime panels coronavirus flexibility for local authorities and police and crime panel meetings regulations for England and Wales 2020. This meeting is being live streamed and recorded and will be available on YouTube for members of the public and press. I'd like to hand over now to Stephanie Hancock in Democratic Services for apologies, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've received apologies from Councillors Jarvis, Moore and Priest. Would you like me now to ask the rest of the members to introduce themselves?
Yes, please.
Okay, Mr. Ager, would you like to
Mike Ager, independent member.
Mr. Hussain?
Yeah, evening everybody. Jay Hussain, independent member.
Mr. Doyle?
Good evening all. Peggy Doyle, independent member.
You're a little bit quiet, Mr. Doyle. I don't know whether you can turn your mic up a little bit or shout. And Councillor Allen?
Councillor Peace on Great Bridge Ward.
Thank you. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And I will be asking officers to introduce themselves before each item on the agenda. May I ask as to whether there are any interest to declare on any items to be discussed at this meeting by any members?
No.
Thank you very much indeed. Minutes of the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee held on the 17th of September 2020. Can I confirm they are a correct and accurate record? I'm happy to propose that.
Chair, I'm really sorry. Can we just pause for a second? We're just having a problem
sure.
with the live event. Sorry, can we just pause while we try?
Sure, no problem. No problem at all. Thank you.
While we do that, can I just check, is that any better sound-wise?
It's slightly better.
I'll shout then, there's nobody else around.
The joys of technology, don't worry. We can hear you, Mr. Doyle.
Okay, sorry everyone, you can continue.
Thank you very much. Apologies for that slight technical glitch. Minutes of the previous meeting held on the 17th of September 2020. Can I confirm they are a correct and accurate record of the meeting? Is that agreed?
Aye.
Thank you very much indeed. And now to discuss the Redmond review, Mark Stocks and Zoe Thompson from Grant Thornton, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take this one. I'm happy to take any questions as we go through. So the Redmond review looks at local government audit and financial reporting. So it did seem appropriate to bring this.
Chair, I'm really sorry. We're still having some technical issues. Could I just ask you to pause again? I'm sorry, Mark.
No, that's fine.
Sure.
Just bear with me.
That's fine. I'm not good the second time round, though. I just have to warn you. So.
No problem at all.
Apologies again, everyone. You can continue.
Thank you. So, Mark Stocks to discuss the Redmond review, please.
Thank you, Chair.
From Councillor Thornton.
Thank you. So the Redmond review deals with local government audit and financial reporting. So the audit committee is obviously an appropriate place to bring the report and its findings. And I'll go through the report at a high level, Chair, all the slides at a high level, and just sort of just bring, I suppose, pertinent matters to your attention, and then I'm happy to take questions either as we go through or at the end. So the review was launched in 2019 and was published in September last year. On page 3, we set out the context of what the Redmond report was about. So, it was trying to deal with the fact that local government is complex. So as a result of that, its accounts are far more complex than they were a few years ago, particularly because we're seeing many more innovative transactions. In some instances, local government's accounts haven't been of the quality that the Financial Reporting Council require, because there has been a raising of the bar in terms of their expectations, and similarly, there's a raising in the expectations that they have of us as auditors. There's much more rigor that they require us to apply. So certain things have become unsustainable. It's very hard to deliver an audit of the quality that's required, or a set of accounts of the quality that's required by the FRC to the July deadline. And so that was becoming an issue, I think, with both ourselves and councils. And similarly, it's quite difficult to recruit a local government auditor. We have a significant training program in Grant Thornton, but people invariably sort of choose to move on to other aspects of work, because the audit environment is just so challenging in terms of the timescales that we're required to work to. So there was a view, I think, held by both ourselves and local government that there was need of urgent reform. So just moving on to the next page, there's also some things that needed to be looked at. So I think there's an expectations gap between what people think auditors do and what they actually do. There's also, views around audit quality and what auditors should actually be reporting, and what's of value to yourselves as as those charged with governance, and also to the public in terms of reading the accounts. And then sitting on to page 5, there's a reality that auditors haven't been able to deliver the accounts to that deadline. So and then there's issues around public accountability and sort of how local governments be reporting. And then there's issues around the fragility of the market, and a real risk, unfortunately, that the audit firms may exit the market at the end of of this current contract because of, I suppose, the pressures in terms of fees, in terms of the standards, in terms of audit quality, but also in terms of actually being able to recruit people to undertake the work. So page 6 just deals with that in a little bit more detail. So just in terms of time, I won't go into that in detail, but I'll start at page 7 in terms of what the detailed findings were from the Redmond report. So Redmond reported that he felt there was a lack of system leadership. So there are about 6 bodies that are involved in setting the various standards and contract arrangements and fees that go into local audit, and so that's meant that there's not a clear direction in terms of what local authorities are required to do, but also what we're required to do as auditors. So that's a very difficult thing to to cope with. Turning onto the next page, the procurement of the last contract was set in an environment where the requirements on auditors were significantly less. And so, as auditing standards have changed, then, the contract has not sort of kept pace with what auditors are required to do. So there's concerns around profitability and whether firms will continue to actually invest in the market or whether they will step away. And there are examples of where firms have exited the market, particularly in the NHS. Again, Redmond found, on page 9, that the timescales were unrealistic and unhelpful. Trying to deliver a complex audit like yourselves in 2 months is extremely difficult, and in reality is just not a practical thing to actually ask, and it creates quite significant pressures on local auditors. Redmond sort of reported a view that financial reporting is overly complex. There are different views on that. So I know the Financial Reporting Council would reference back that local government is required to report under international financial reporting standards, and as complex organisations, there is a level of detail that you have to go into. But Redmond was concerned that trying to get somebody to actually understand a set of local government accounts required a level of expertise that was unwarranted, and so he flagged concerns over that complexity. On the back of that, Redmond also talked about governance and the transparency of reporting, both in terms of being able to get the right information in front of the public, but also the challenges that face local councillors in terms of these are highly complex technical accounts. I've spent 30 years being an auditor, and some of the concepts are challenging. So so how do we get to a set of accounts where it's actually helpful to you in terms of the judgments that you make, and in terms of how you provide stewardship to the council. And then finally, Redmond reported around a debate that I think we've had at this committee, just around, where are the risks in local government? So should auditors be focusing on the valuations of property and pensions, or should we be focusing on income and expenditure and the financial sustainability of local government? Now, clearly that's a significant debate in terms of, what's the value of local audit, and where do you want us to spend our time? So Tony's recommendations, there were quite significant ones. So he recommended that there was a new regulator called the Office of Local Audit and Regulation. He recommended that there was a review of fees, and that the July deadline was moved back to September, and that there was a process of around accounts simplification, and a process of looking at how to sort of improve governance and reporting of local audit to the council. And then a suggestion that there needed to be account summaries that helped local users of the accounts get a more thorough understanding. Since the report was pre-produced, MHCLG have come out and they issued their response. So what they're thinking of at the moment, well, they've accepted many of the recommendations. The one they're most concerned about is the recommendation to set up a separate regulator. So that's very unlikely to go ahead. But on the rest of them, they set up a number of forums and committees to look at sort of how they can set the right deadline, and how they sort of change the contracting structure to ensure that there's a stability of supply of local audit into local government, but also to make sure that the reporting framework's in the right place. So when we do report to you, it's at a level where there's clear accountability and understandability in terms of the financial statements. From my perspective, it's an important review. It's one that will set the tone of what we do over the next decade. So it's important that we get it right. I'm going to pause there, Chair. It's a long presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. That's really useful and clearly a number of challenges that are being experienced now, a number of challenges on the horizon. Any questions or comments? Mr. Ager.
Well, just a comment, really. The government clearly isn't enthusiastic about another regulatory body. If that didn't happen, does it take away from the other recommendations, if it did?
I think we can press ahead with with many of the recommendations, and that's what MHCLG are doing. The comments that we've fed back to them are that they need to, if it's not OLAR, which is the abbreviation for the regulator, then they need to find another system leader, because at the moment, so at the moment to deliver an audit, I have to work with the NAO, ICAW, the FRC, with SIPFA, and with the NAO, as well as MHCLG. So there's sort of 6 or 7 who are influencing us on what we do, and we want a single regulator that sets the framework for audit, who sets the accounting code for use. So there does have to be a solution, but it doesn't have to be OLAR. And some of the recommendations can go ahead as without any of that. It's just pace of change, Mike.
Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Ager. And just a comment from me, really, Mark, and not one that I expect a response to, but I do get the feeling that the government's reluctance to introduce OLA may have something to do with the fact that getting rid of the Audit Commission initially may now appear to them to be a mistake. So obviously introducing OLA is in a sense admitting that getting rid of that system that was in place previously was not the right thing to do. But there we are. Let's see how things progress. But it's encouraging to hear that the recommendations are not exclusive, that the other school are looking like they will go ahead. I think it's an important review. Are there any further questions or comments, colleagues? Well, thank you very much for that, Mark, and we'll stay with you actually for the external audit update from yourselves at Grant Thornton as well, please, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. I'm only going to talk to one page of this report. I'm happy to take questions on the others, but I'll just talk to page 4 of the report, and that's just to bring you up to speed with where we are with the audit of the 1920 accounts, because obviously we're now past the deadline of 30th of November. So we've actually made quite a lot of progress in the last month and a half. So I'm hopeful that either towards the end of this month or really in March, that we will be able to sign the opinion on the financial statements. But I just wanted to flag to you a couple of issues and just, I suppose, explain the delays in terms of the audit. In general, there's a delay in audit across the country. Trying to deliver an audit through remote working is very difficult. To be candid, there's just not that closeness that audit teams usually have with the finance team to try and get queries resolved and papers shared and moved on. So you're not alone in audits being delayed, and I think at the moment where we've completed 75% of our audits, and we're the best performing supplier of all the local auditors. So that's not unusual. The things that I did just want to flag to you, that when we report to you, we will be flagging a couple of areas of significant concern. The area that's taken us most time to get through this year is property, plant and equipment. That's one of the estimates where the Financial Reporting Council has asked us to do more work. They're really clear that it's an extensive estimate, and that there's an expectation that you do it particularly well. So this year we've spent more time on auditing that, and I suppose my concern is that there are some clear deficiencies in terms of the council's of systems and processes. In particular, your asset register is a number of spreadsheets. So I think there's about 8 spreadsheets on which your housing assets, your other land and buildings, and so on, your investment properties held. And to be candid, that's just not appropriate for a council of your size with the significant asset base that you have. So it's taken us a significant amount of time to work through that and try and make sure that we're comfortable with with how the property is brought to accounts in your financial statements. And similarly, where we've sort of asked for information to support some of the assumptions within the valuations, because as you can imagine, when you value something, then there's quite a lot goes into it, whether it's sort of the floor area of the building, or the yield rate on the investment property, or the obsolescence rate. There's quite a lot of information, and to actually collate that information to get to us has taken the council a significant amount of time. Officers have been really cooperative with us, and they've worked hard to try and resolve that. But I do think there's something the council needs to think about in terms of getting a computerized system that enables it to do its financial reporting more quickly, and also a computer system that kind of brings together some of the information that's going into the valuations. So because you're going to need that every year, and it's not really appropriate for it to be sort of held in, I don't know, on one computer or another computer. So that's a significant area that I just want to flag to you, and that we'll be sort of raising in the audit findings report, and working with the council on over the next year to try and resolve. The other area is around provisions, and we've looked in detail at both provisions for unrecoverable debt. So you can imagine the council has a number of trade receipts, but it also has the HRA, it has NDR, it has council tax. So it's particularly important that when you're looking at that those provisions are brought to account appropriately. And similarly, on business rates, then you have to take a view on how many appeals are going to be undertaken against you in the future, because you're now responsible for the collection of those business rates. And when we've looked, we've not been particularly satisfied with the level of record keeping or how those provisions are put together. So when we report back to you, there will be significant changes in terms of the provisions that the council is having to make. Zoe and I are just putting together the final view in terms of those provisions, but there will be adjustments to the financial statements on the back of it. There are other issues within the audit report, sort of around misstatements in disclosure notes, but also around cash and creditors, and we'll just be flagging those to you as we go through. So I suppose there are areas that I would hope the council would start to move and improve on over the next financial year. The final thing I just wanted to flag on page 4 is not to do with 1920. It's to do with 2021, and we'll soon start that audit, only having just exited 1921. But just to flag to you that the NAO has changed. its code that we work to, and what it's done, it's changed how we assess the value for money provided by the council, and it's required. So in previous years, we've looked at informed decision making, sustainable resource deployment, and working with partners and other third parties. What they're going to require us to do going forward is to look at sort of still the financial sustainability of the council, but also its governance, but also its economy, efficiency and effectiveness in terms of service performance. And I suppose the more fundamental change is that previously we've only looked at that on an exception basis where we felt there's a significant risk. Going forward, we have to report on that in full. So we have to make an assessment in each area, and our report does go into the public domain. So that's quite a fundamental change I just wanted to flag to you for 2021. I'm going to pause there, Chair. I'm more than happy to take any questions on either the aspects of the report I've spoken about or anything else in there that you want to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Mark. And it is concerning to hear those issues, but reassuring to hear that you've highlighted those, and that there's cooperation and large level of joint working to look at some of those issues. Just going to go to questions now. I think Councillor Allen was the first to raise his hand, I believe. Councillor Allen.
Yeah, really, I'm appalled, to be honest, that with the asset register that for accounting purposes that is held on an Excel spreadsheet. Nothing can be more fragile, and if we lose that tomorrow, how is it backed up? Where's it held? I mean, really, we need Audit to go in there and do some management in terms of if it's still on an Excel spreadsheet for a while, that it is backed up regularly, it is put somewhere else in a safe regularly, because we cannot continue with something as fragile as that. One wrong button press, properties could drop off without any. I assume there is no audit trail linked to any of the records on there, so we really need to have to get back together on that. We have an awful lot of assets, and somebody then sort of have an accident, as happens with spreadsheets, we could be in big trouble. So I'd really like some action, Chair, that identifies at least a temporary measure of increased security and liability and probability that we manage it better. Thank you, Chair.
Yes. Thank you, Councillor Allen, and I completely concur with you on that. And I'd be interested to know how much of a long-standing issue this is. Is this a historic issue? How long has this been the case? Because you would think that something as important as Councillor Allen says, as our asset register is managed as a backup, another backup and a backup after that, really. So I'd be interested in that. Mr. Ager?
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions. First, following on from that, can we be assured that our own internal audit people will be involved very much in setting up the new system?
Peter, Mark?
Yes, Mike, we'll be looking into the new system as and when it's introduced to make sure that it has the appropriate controls and backups we would expect to see in place.
So just through you, Chair. So
Yes.
So I'm, the asset registers will be backed up, even though they're on quite naturally through the system. So I don't think there's any risk that that the data is going to be lost. But I do accept the risk that one wrong push on a button sort of creates the asset or could lead to a fault. So and I'm strongly supportive of you moving to a proper sort of computerized fixed asset register. That decision needs to work through management. So a business case has to be put together, and and there'll have to be resources diverted to doing it. But I would hope, as an audit committee, that you would support that proposal when it comes through. As Peter said, I would expect internal audit to be involved in any new computer system coming through.
Yes, and Mark, I don't know, in your conversations, have you received any assurance back that is going on? That's in the pipeline to be developed urgently, this computer system.
I can't say I've heard anything about it being done urgently. I think there's an acceptance from the finance team that it needs to be done, but they clearly, the County Council has processes to work through. But I would hope it would be accepted and moved along quickly.
Yeah, can I just bring in Sergit, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just on that issue, just to reassure the committee that matter was discussed at the statutory officers meeting, and so that this matter and this issue can be addressed very quickly. So just to reassure that, yes, steps are in hand in order for this particular issue to be addressed as quickly as possible.
I'm grateful for that, Sergit, and I'm reassured to hear that Peter and internal audit will be involved in supporting that. Rebecca, Section 151 officer.
Chair, sorry, just before you speak, Rebecca, sorry, just to let you know that Mr. Doyle has had his hand up for some time now as well.
I do apologise, Mr. Doyle. I'll come to you very quickly. Rebecca, first, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Sergit said. Myself and Tammy, who's the director of Regen and is responsible for our property portfolio, are setting up a working group to look at the new system. So that should be happening shortly.
That's reassuring. Thank you, Rebecca. And at the appropriate time, it would be good for us as audit committee, I think, as well, to get some feedback on that, so we know how that's going and how that's progressing. Mr. Doyle, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Mark, for your report and the work done. And I just wanted to confirm a couple of points, because I think Peter and Mr. Ago actually addressed most of my queries. What level of changes the accounts have the issues you've identified actually resulted in? So,
I'm sorry, Councillor. I'm struggling to hear you. So sorry.
I'll shout as loud as I can. So, just wanted to confirm the extent of actual changes required to the accounts versus just delays due to not having the information. So, on PPE in particular, have you had to make adjustments to the accounts, or the council had to make adjustments to the accounts? And similarly, on the provisions, I'm assuming we were under-provided rather than over-provided.
So on the provisions, there's a mixture. So on business rate appeals, there was a significant under-provision. But when we've looked at the what will be called the credit loss allowances, so the provisions for like rent arrears and so on, they appear to be significantly overstated. So it could be that when we take it all in the round, that they balance out. But I just need to finalise that with the audit team. But I suppose from my perspective, they're equally concerning, because I would expect you to be well. This is, I suppose, in my terms, this is proper money. So this is what you make decisions on. So so you need to be aware of, in terms of what provisions have we made and what do we have to spend. So I'm equally concerned about both. But they are sizable changes as well. It's not sort of $500,000 or $1 million. These are many millions of pounds that we're going to adjust these provisions by. I suppose my frustration with PPE is, having done all that work, then no, there aren't that many significant adjustments. And so, it's taken a lot of my time, a lot of my team's time, but a lot of your officers' time to come to the position that the valuations are okay, I'm going to end up charging you a significant amount more because of the time taken, and it could have been avoided if you had an appropriate system. So, but the more concerning one for me is the provisions, because that it could have turned out otherwise.
Excellent. Thanks for clarifying, Mark.
Thank you for that, Mark. Anyone else to come in on this item, please?
Chair, Mr. Ager has his hand up.
Mr. Ager.
Mr. Ager, you're on mute.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I think the question presented is rather like a stone previously unturned. I mean, I think it's right to say that our external auditors were encouraged from somewhere else to look at reserves, and they have done, and they found us a bit wanting. On the question of provisions, this is actually a very crucial area in any organisation's accounts. I mean, it's probably one of the most crucial. It's the easiest place to hide things, lose things, and that sort of thing. So I'm very pleased those are being looked at. And presumably we'll have another meeting of this committee this side of Easter, I hope, at which we'll hear management's comments back on your recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So yes, the plan is to try and complete the audit as soon as we can now, and once that's done, the council's plan is to call an audit committee, with the permission of the chair at the earliest opportunity. But we need to make sure that everything's complete before we do that, so we can give you a full picture. But it will definitely be before Easter. I would hope it was in February. It might be in early March.
Thank you for that, Mark, and absolutely from my perspective, the sooner we're in a position to be able to do that, the better. Yes, so, and if there are not any further questions, then...
Chair, Mr. Hussain has his hand up.
Mr. Hussain, please.
Thanks, Chair. Mark, yeah, thanks for the report. Just a quick one on the changes to VFM. It's good to see those changes, Mark. I know we go around in a bit of a circle with VFM over the years and decades, as I've bored you with before in the past. I see the word governance has cropped up again, so that's quite a big area. A couple of things on that, Mark. Firstly, what exactly will you be looking at under governance? I imagine there's a bit of a shopping list there, but I just wonder if there's anything specifically MAO had in mind. The reason why I ask is, of course, governance is squarely part of the internal audit definition of what they do as well. So, I just wonder what the relationship will be in terms of what you do versus internal audit's mandate around governance. And secondly, more of an observation, the second bullet on page 6 is welcome, Mark, about more extensive reporting. I've always had an issue with this by exception on value for money. It never really made much sense. So I think that's a welcome development, Mark, just to get a story around VFM. But yeah, going back to governance, any comments on that, please?
Thank you, Jay. So it is a comprehensive review of governance, and in terms of your question around internal audit, we work really closely with internal audit, so we will take cognizance of what they've done, and so that we don't sort of refocus on areas where we already have assurance. But it works all the way through, the operation of the council and its committees to how the council is setting and managing its budget, to how it's managing its services, to officer behaviour, to members' behaviour. So it is how it's dealing with its companies. So in terms of groups, how it's sort of looking at its investment decisions in terms of in its capital spend. So it's a proper look at the governance of the council, and and not on an exception basis. This is kind of looking at everything from decision making to the sort of, I suppose, the detail of how services are run. So it is quite thorough this year. So it is important that we're reporting back to you on a regular basis with what we're finding, and having the right conversations, because clearly this will go into the public domain and is effectively a report on, how the council is running itself.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. And just further to that, very quickly, if I may, I was interested in what you mentioned around economic efficiency. So what would that be? Would that be looking at value for money, or what does that encompass, or does it go greater than that in terms of where's the council investing, where's it allocating its resources, etc., etc.?
Well, it's all of those. So it's sort of, is the council aligning its resources to its strategic plan? So is it putting the resources in the right place? So are you procuring effectively? So, are you kind of, wedded to, to a certain form of provision that's not providing you both quality and efficiency in terms of cost, I suppose. Then it's, how do you benchmark your services, both in terms of their performance and in terms of their financial performance? So it's very much looking at, what are you doing to try and understand the services that you provide to make sure that they're as effective, efficient as they can be.
Yes.
So we've sort of invested quite heavily there, Chair. Our advisory team have a system of sort of financial benchmarking where they can highlight where services are perhaps more expensive than they ought to be, and we'll be using that to sort of look into a bit more depth into terms of the services you provide.
Sure, and I think it goes back to something we said earlier on in the meeting on the item regarding the Redmond review, that audit has developed so much over the years, and now that councils are doing so much more and are far more complex in terms of what they do and what we do on a regular basis, it's really made everything else move with it, and there's certainly a huge amount of work for everyone to do moving forward. But thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to yourself, Zoe, and Grant Thornton, and all the huge amount of work that you do. We are incredibly and immensely grateful, as are our residents, for the huge role that you play, and the role that Peter and his team play in internal audit as well, in making sure we are as robust as possible in everything that we do. Really appreciate you coming to the meeting today.
No, that's very kind, Chair. But I have to say this is a team effort. We work very closely with Peter, but we also work, really closely with Rebecca and Claire. So I think it's been a task for the finance team to pull together a set of accounts. And, while I have some concern, then, that team's worked, really closely with us and, and tried to help us wherever possible. So I wouldn't want to go away from this meeting without mentioning that.
No, absolutely. And I completely concur with you. I think Rebecca and her team do a phenomenal job, and particularly a lot of the work that they've been doing around ensuring people get grants and support, etc., has been really, really impressive. Really impressive. Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate that. Yeah. If we could move on then to the next agenda item around, now this item comes before the committee, colleagues, as you're aware, on an annual basis, regarding internal audit, what internal audit does, and how it really fits in, I suppose, to that wider picture that we have around the council. And for the internal audit charter, could we ask Peter, please, to speak to this item? Peter Farrer.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, as the Chair's just explained, the internal audit charter really sets out the framework within which we as your internal auditors operate. We've adopted the model that was provided within the public sector internal audit standards, so we haven't sort of deviated from the best practice model as such. What it does, this charter, as you can see before you, it lays out a definition of internal audit, and that's about providing independent assurance to yourselves on key areas such as governance, which we've just been discussing. It also sets out the principles in which we're expected to operate, the authority and standards that sort of the framework within which we operate there, the fact that internal audit is a statutory function within the Local Audit and Accountability Act, that we report directly to the Section 151 officer, which is currently Rebecca as the head of finance. It goes on to talk about the scope and objectives of the work that we do, our responsibilities, how we have to remain independent from the areas that we review, and also how we need to go about reporting back to the committee should we be doing any consultancy work and similarly fraud work. And as you're probably aware, that you get a regular fraud update, usually every 3 to 6 months. When it was last presented to the Audit Committee last year, I think the committee were aware that as the internal auditors for Sandwell Council, we also provide the internal audit service for a number of other organisations, namely the West Midlands Fire Service, Sandwell Children's Trust and Sandwell Leisure Trust. And the committee asked us to incorporate into the charter just to make that clear as to exactly where this committee's responsibilities would rely with regards to that arrangement. So towards the end of the charter, we've included reference to that, and each of those 3 organisations I just mentioned all have their own sort of equivalent of an audit committee. So they have a separate internal audit plan, internal audit reports, an annual report, and their own version of an annual governance statement. So the work that we do for those organisations stands separately from the work that we do for Sandwell Council. So there's no actual role for this audit committee to have to get involved in any of those areas. Obviously, 2 of them, the Leisure Trust and the Children's Trust, are quite closely linked to Sandwell Council, and where appropriate, their arrangements would feed into our annual governance statement. But on the internal audit front, there's that clear separation. So that is the only change since this document was last presented to the committee. And I think this evening we're just looking for yourselves to comment on, and if you're in agreement with it, to reapprove it. Thank you. As Mark was saying at the end of each of his papers, more than happy to answer any questions on any of the items I'm presenting tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And can I welcome that incorporation as well, because I think there was a bit of an anxiety on my part, and I know on the part of other colleagues on this committee, to have that clearly defined in terms of particularly the organisations with whom the council has a close working relationship. So we're very clear on where we stand and where we all stand in terms of auditing and those systems. That's quite welcome. I believe someone has raised their hand. Unfortunately, I'm unable to see whom has raised their hand.
It's Mr. Hussain.
Mr. Hussain, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Peter. Note the addition that I think we spoke about a few months ago. That's good. I just wondered what your thoughts were around this new the changes.
I'm sorry, I've lost Mr. Hussain. I don't know if everybody else.
Sorry, hi. Sorry, can you hear me? Apologies.
Yeah.
Pressing all the wrong buttons, Peter.
Yes, we can hear you now, Mr. Hussain. Yes.
Okay, sorry. No, just saying thanks for that incorporation, Peter, into the charter. I think that just completes it. That's good. Welcome that. Just wondered what your thoughts were around the previous question around governance and the external audit VFM mandate on that. Because whilst obviously external audit has been going through some turbulence and change over the last few years, for me, internal audit is pretty well established now in terms of its roles and responsibilities, its definitions, all the standards and this, that and the other. But now all of a sudden external audit now sort of doing work on VFM on governance. I just wondered what your thoughts were around that in terms of how you now work with external audit, just to make, because governance is a huge area and Mark just outlined very succinctly pretty much everything under that banner. Of course, you have a role in that as well as part of your coverage. Will there be an impact on what you do? How will you plan your work now? In terms of making sure there's no overlap. So the committee are assured that the total audit results, Grant Thornton and yourself, are sort of directed and used most effectively.
Thank you, Mr. Hussain. Yes, it's still early days in the new arrangements, and we will be scheduling a couple of meetings with Mark and Zoe to get a clearer definition of exactly what that would involve. But at the moment, within internal audit, where we sort of play a key role on the governance front, and 2 documents that do actually come before this committee are on the Code of Corporate Governance, which is currently being reviewed, and I think is scheduled to come into probably the next full meeting of this committee, and also the annual governance statement, which I see as a key document, which does pull together all the sources of assurance, including from the external auditors, ourselves as your internal auditors, directly from directors and cabinet members themselves, and it will. We received a number of recommendations last year from Grant Thornton on that, so we'll be looking to develop and enhance the annual governance statement, and it will be interesting to see exactly what the role Grant Thornton will play in sort of the development of that and across the wider governance framework, because as you mentioned there, Mr. Hussain, it's still early days in this sort of new route, but we do work very closely together with Grant Thornton, and I'm sure that between us we'll avoid any duplication, and they'll be able to, if not necessarily place reliance, but take into consideration the work that we do on the governance front. And you mentioned about internal audit being established for many years, and you'll probably be aware yourself, the development from systems-based auditing to risk-based auditing has really helped the focus on governance, and there's an element of governance in virtually all of the audits we do, even those that appear initially to be more operational, but we always take account of the governance and risk management of every area that we look at.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. Sorry, Chair, if I can, I mean, that's exactly the point, Peter. It is quite well integrated now into good internal audit service. So I think that thinking process with Grant Thornton is really important. So whatever it is that they do, genuinely adds value on top of what you've already done. And I can see some risks around overlap and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's just a bit of a memo to ourselves, really, just to make sure that planning happens and the committee are made aware of exactly where the lines begin and end. Peter?
Yep, yeah, sure. And on Grant Thornton's enhanced involvement now in governance, that will be nationally driven predominantly by the National Audit Office, so it will be the same across the sector. So it will be interesting to see how that, like you say, does develop.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Peter and Mr. Hussain. Steph, who do we have next, please?
Joe, I don't see any hands up at the moment.
Okay, so if there's any more questions or comments, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, we can proceed towards the vote on the internal audit charter. No more questions or comments that I see. So if we may, Steph, can we proceed towards the vote, please, on this item?
Yes, Chair, it would just be yourself and Councillor Allen voting.
Yes, so I vote for.
Yeah, and I vote for as well.
Unanimously passed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So if we could move on now, staying with yourself, Peter, if we may. We had the external audit update earlier. Let's have the internal audit update now, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is the internal audit update report that brings the committee up to date with the work that internal audit have completed as at 31st of December 2020. So the first 9 months of the year. And obviously the purpose of that is that at the end of the year, it will feed into my head of audit opinion and our ability to give or not give reasonable assurance on the adequacy and effectiveness of the governance, risk management and internal control arrangements. At this point in time, there is nothing in the work that we've completed so far that causes me undue concern, although there are a couple of issues that I will flag later on as I work my way through this report. As you will see in the table, we've completed a dozen or so pieces of work since the start of the year. The majority of them we've been able to give substantial or at least satisfactory assurance, which is generally a clean bill of health in those areas, and that's pleasing to see. But as you will notice, we did give 2 limited assurance reports, one on day-to-day repairs and one on facilities management and in particular work around roofing contractors. Just to give you a little bit of narrative and background to some of the work that we've completed this year and is listed in that table. We did a review of the council complaints process, and I felt that was strong. But we noticed a couple of occasions where the system that's used to record responses hadn't been updated in a timely manner, and also where in 2 or 3 cases we'd sort of settled complaints verbally, and our recommendation was that we think the council should always follow those up, like I say, even if they have been agreed in person. It would just be better to have a standing record between ourselves and the person who made the complaint that it had been adequately resolved. We also had a look at discretionary housing payments, which are a number of payments that are made each month for residents living in Sandwell if they're struggling with meeting the cost of their housing, etc. And the payments that we looked at were accurate and were made in a timely manner, but the spreadsheet that was being maintained and the system records, because the system records were kept in a cumulative way, meant that you lost each month's total of payments, which was a bit of an oversight. So we've made a recommendation that they retain a copy of those, which they are now doing, which enables a fuller recommendation between payments and the system to take place. Procurement cards. Again, some of this was really focused on sort of at the start of COVID-19 and the pandemic. There was a need to increase the amounts that could be used on procurement cards and the number of them that were in circulation, because at the time the council really didn't have any sort of clear idea or understanding of how the pandemic could impact upon its ability to procure goods and services in a sort of urgent manner. So we had no issue with those increases taking place. We were heavily involved in the approvals of those, and we've also been monitoring the return back to sort of pre-COVID levels wherever possible. We did feel that there was a little bit of hesitancy to reduce those, and it could have probably been done in a more timely manner, but we understand the caution at the time, and even now, as with all local authorities, we still can't be absolutely guaranteed that we've got that right, and we may need to increase those limits again in the future. But as those increases were introduced, we did also note that some of the recording by the budget managers with regards to the receipting of the use of the cards and making sure that receipts were available was slow, which meant that some payments were being authorised and processed without really having the evidence seen in advance. Again, since we flagged that, and with the reduction in their use, that situation has improved since that time. And in many ways, I can understand why that took place, because, as I say, we were operating in unique times. Just to flag maybe 1 or 2 more of the pieces of work that we looked at. Accounts payable, one of the key financial systems. Again, overall, a good level of assurance, although we did feel that the controls around duplicate payments or potential duplicate payments could be strengthened. Bank account changes. You're probably aware that a couple of years ago we had an issue where the council was subject to a bank mandate fraud, where a third party purporting to be a supplier asked for a change of account, and that went through the council system. Since that time, it has been, strongly improved, the control framework there, as it has been across the sector. The prevalence of bank mandate fraud has just increased over recent times. So we have got a strong process in place, but we just felt that the access rights of officers who could make those changes needed to be checked and reconciled, and also a more detailed reconciliation between the requests for those changes and the changes made on the system. Again, all our recommendations have been accepted and put in place, and we will be revisiting to make sure that they have actually been embedded. The 2 that I really wanted to flag, the limited assurance reports, and it's disappointing to see that some of the issues cross over across those two reports. The day-to-day repairs, this is where we've entered into a series of contracts with suppliers to come in and carry out day-to-day repairs, both within our housing stock and on sort of council-owned properties, corporate office blocks, etc. And rightly so, we go out and get quotes and tenders for a set period of time, but because a number of service areas use those contracts, tap into them, and nobody appeared to be monitoring the usage that was being made, we did find that we were spending significantly more than was in the original contracts. Now, really, when you start to get to the end of a contract limit, you should be looking at going out to contract or tender again, rather than just to continue incurring spend with those suppliers. Similarly, another issue we wanted to flag is that we have what's known as primary contractors and secondary contractors. Now, whenever a job needs doing, really, we should be contacting the primary contractor first. If they are unable to do the job in a set period of time, we then approach the secondary contractors. Now, what we found that there seemed to be more spend with the secondary contractors. Now, that may be fine, but the council should really be retaining records and evidence to demonstrate that it did contact the primary contractors first, and we found in the majority of cases that that wasn't happening. So again, it was disappointing that we were unable as an authority to demonstrate that we knew the difference between those contractors and why we were approaching secondary contractors. And similarly, with the facilities management and roofing contracts that we looked at, same sort of issues really. The lack of being able to demonstrate that we were using primary contractors in the first instance, and also because some of this work is emergency and reactive, that we call them out to come out and you need to be here within 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. Again, we weren't retaining evidence or records to show that they were meeting those targets. So it was, so we couldn't really give any assurance that they were coming out in the times that we would expect them to. So as I say, they're the two limited assurance reports that I just wanted to flag this off. We've worked really closely with the interim director there, Tammy Stokes, and she's put in some strong controls there. And like I say, she's been very receptive to our ideas, which was pleasing to hear. Just one other thing that I wanted to flag that's in the report today is the impact of COVID-19 upon internal audit, as with all internal audit sections across local authority, nationwide. It has impacted upon our ability to deliver some of those audits because, and rightly so, some members of the internal audit team were at the time redeployed into sort of the track and trace system, into the welfare hub, and predominantly working on the support for businesses, local businesses, in helping to process the small and discretionary business grants that local government introduced. And this was mainly round about spring and summer. Since that time, there has been a return to the internal audit fold by most of our officers, and it hasn't impacted too much on our ability to deliver the audit plan. There are a small number of audits that we think we're unlikely to complete before the year end, and we'll flag those in our next report when we've got a better understanding of exactly the resource we've got left to where we need to focus that resource. Other than that, towards the end of the report, we just also identify a few other areas where we believe that we add value to the council and the work of this committee. But to summarise, I guess, we've done a significant number of reviews so far to date. Most have been generally okay, a few issues here and there to be implemented, 2 limited assurance reports, disappointing, but ultimately we don't think that will impact on our overall opinion. So that's sort of the position statement from internal audit as at the end of December. Happy to try and answer any questions that members may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, and thank you very much to you and your team for the great work as ever. Mr. Ager, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I mean, clearly the repairs service is a frontline service. It's where the council comes directly in face of those who pay our wages, so to speak. And I did wonder whether a limited assurance report in that area, whilst I hear what Peter says, might be an opportunity to ask the executive in charge of that service to come and talk to the committee about what has been done to put things right, so to speak. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Ager, and I'm certainly agreeable to that. I think that would be a good idea. And I think, we all recognise the unprecedented challenges that COVID presents. Peter, can I bring you back in on that one?
Yeah, just to follow up with the point that Mr. Ager raised, more than happy to invite the director to attend the next meeting. Depends on the next meeting if it's purely to review and sign off the accounts, or if it's more a business as usual meeting. But if we can agree the next business as usual meeting, I will invite the director to come along and give you an update.
Thank you very much for that, Peter. Steph, who is next, please?
Mr. Doyle.
Mr. Doyle, please.
Thank you, Chair. And again, thanks, Peter. Clearly, you've done some good work there and found some interesting findings. A couple of questions I'll follow up. I suppose one would be, we aren't necessarily diving into all the detail of all the issues, but some of them sound a bit like they're repeat issues. Do we have a feeling as to why these are reoccurring? And then I've got a follow-on question once you've answered that.
Yeah, as Mr. Ager pointed out, they're frontline services, so they're generally responsive. And sometimes I think in that rush to deliver those services, that they don't necessarily pay due attention to the council's processes, and possibly because they are quite remote from the core of the council and may not be as au fait with the need to adhere to financial procedures and financial regulations, etc. So it could be an amalgamation of those issues, and it's something that, as I mentioned before, the director is looking into, because they are pretty discrete areas within the council. We don't find those sort of issues elsewhere when we do similar reviews.
Okay, thanks, Peter. And the second, the COVID changes that IAT made a lot of sense, were pragmatic in the circumstances. Is there any plans to address any potential independence issues for any of the areas where effectively you jumped into first line activity?
I think some of the work, say, around the welfare hub and the track and trace processes, we wouldn't necessarily, they wouldn't fall under what you'd recognise as a traditional auditable area within the audit universe. So I don't see any conflict there as such. With regards to the business grants, that's an interesting point, because a lot of internal audit teams across the country have been involved in those, because they've sort of got it falls under our skills matrix, really, of the areas that audits are good at. So we have been involved in a lot of sort of checks on the validity of the businesses and the applications, and we have been reporting quite closely to central government on that, and following the guidance that came from the Government Counter Fraud Centre. So again, I wouldn't necessarily say at this point in time that would be subject to an audit review in itself, but if there's a drive from central government or elsewhere that these areas need to be retrospectively reviewed, then it is a good point that you make, and it may be that it would be difficult for us to do that with an element of independence. But there could be solutions, like across the West Midlands, we could maybe audit another local authority's processes, and they could do ours with regards to business grants if it is felt that there is a need for those reviews to take place.
Excellent. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Doyle. And I think it would be, going back to what we were discussing earlier, and the new regulations and requirements the government's introduced, particularly the greater emphasis around governance that has now been given to external audit. It'd be interesting to see how that manifests itself, and as to whether the government will be, I don't know, relying more on external audit. They clearly are struggling as it is, quite frankly. I mean, we heard that from Mark Stocks today regarding the huge pressures that they're under, and the amount of accounts across the board that are not being able to be signed off in time. So it'd be interesting to see how that happens moving forward. Steph, who do we have next, please?
Mr. Hussain.
Mr. Hussain, please.
Thanks, Chair. A sort of consolidated comment. I echo what Mr. Ager said about perhaps a bit more challenge being introduced by getting the owners to the audit committee, Peter. I think that's a good thing. I've seen it elsewhere. It sort of has an effect. So certainly, I think that's an excellent idea. Mr. Doyle's point about the independence issue, we're obviously thinking the same things, but I think I concur with what you said, Peter, about the it's almost like a grants audit, isn't it, type to be involved, but there needs to be some sort of workaround around that. I suppose the question I really had was sort of is summed up by the comment the chair just made around going back to my topic of the evening around governance. I mean, just this is perhaps something you're still working on for next year. So when I look down the list of audits, I mean, they're quite micro and discrete. Are there any plans next year, do you think, Pete, to do sort of, the big, sexy, cross-cutter governance type reviews that are quite strategically focused, where, apparently internal audit can really max out on value and so on? I may have asked this before, Peter, or may have spoken offline, but it'd be nice to see something like that going in, where internal audit, that sort of, helicopter strategic overview through a strategic audit review of something strategic. I'm saying the word strategic a lot. Any plans for that? Because it'd be good to see those sort of reviews under a governance banner, for example, interspersing all the detailed, excellent work you do on the sort of operational systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the plan as it's in its early stages at this moment will predominantly be focused upon two key areas. One, how we dealt with the pandemic and how that impacted upon our governance arrangements. Right. And probably more importantly, two, going forward, again, what are the governance arrangements going forward? What have we learned? What have we changed? What are the controls around that? So I think next year's plan will, like I say, predominantly be focusing upon those areas, and some of the more traditional audit reviews and operational areas will take a back seat next year, because as you rightly point out, the key risks are in those strategic areas.
Yeah, I mean, other than the, sorry, just come back, Chair, other than some of the repeat offenders that one of my colleagues has raised, that we do need to get on top of. I know there are mitigations, Peter, around frontline and stuff, but it does go to culture and behaviour, I suppose. Mm-hmm. It just seems to me the risk is going upstairs slightly. We've done some of these operational things to death now. So if that's what's on your mind, then I would certainly, I look forward to seeing that, Peter. Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks very much.
And sorry, just to add to that, while they're not necessarily reviews of internal audit, we are quite heavily involved in the preparation of the annual governance statement, as I mentioned earlier, and the code of corporate governance, and obviously the counter fraud agenda. So there are strategic areas where we do get involved and play a day-to-day role, but as you pointed out, probably not so much doing a review, an audit review of those, but sort of working alongside the council in those areas. And it may be that we try to separate that out and bring that a bit more to the fore in next year's report.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Steph, who do we have next, please?
We have Mr. Ager.
Mr. Ager.
Mr. Ager, you're on mute.
We're still struggling to hear you, Mr. Ager, unfortunately.
Struggling to get the right. Is that
there you are. We can hear you, sir, loud and clear.
Well, it's technical complication. Yes, COVID grant is a very interesting one. I mean, Peter's right to say that his side have an interest in some ways. Of course, there's a lot of public concern, I think, about the alleged level of fraud and activity in this area. And I do think that someone is going to have to have a look at that nationally and perhaps locally. Just a comment. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Ager. Peter, please jog my memory if I'm incorrect, but I do recall we received a report from Oliver in the counter fraud update, and I don't think this. I don't know if this data is obviously a few months old now, but we were shown figures where the vast majority of the grants that there appeared to be no issue with, and there was a limited number in Sandwell, at least at the time, that were being investigated and further inquiries were being made. I don't know whether that's still the situation, but that was certainly my understanding at the time.
Yes, that's right, Chair, and Oliver plans to bring a report to the next business as usual committee meeting, updating members on the progress, and generally we've managed to whittle down a number of those outstanding ones we had at the time. There are still a small number that we're continuing to investigate further, and also since that time there's been the introduction of a whole array of new grants as we've entered into various lockdowns, from when it was tier 2, T3, T4 to national lockdowns to wet book payments. It's been a whole, like I say, increased number of grants, and the complexity around those and trying to stay on top of those has been a challenge. But the fraud team have been working alongside the payments team in making sure that we do as many checks as we can. It's obviously a fine balance between getting the payments out to the businesses to support them in a timely manner, in a very timely manner, while also making sure that we do a suitable level of due diligence on them. And I think there was an acceptance from government that while we had a pre-payment assurance framework, there would also be a range of post-payment assurance activities, and it may be that that work continues for some time. In an ideal situation, when the first small business and discretionary grant regime ended, we would have then had the time to go back and double, treble check on areas of potential concern. Obviously, unfortunately, like I've mentioned, a whole raft of new grants, and it's continued and continued. So it's really having that opportunity to catch your breath and go back and reconsider what we did at that time. But hopefully there'll be a point in time when we can do that. It may be further away than we would have ideally hoped, but I just think this issue will probably be around for a good year or two as we work our way through them.
Yes. No, certainly one. I agree with you, Peter, for us to certainly look at moving forward, and it is extraordinarily complicated, and I can't say enough how grateful we are to everyone at the council who's been involved in distributing what have been absolute lifelines, I know, for businesses across the borough. Absolutely. Steph, anyone else, please?
No more hands up, no, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed for that, and thank you again, Peter, for your hard work and that of your team. It's tough times, but we'll certainly get through them, as we always do. Now moving on, colleagues, if we may, to the SIPFA Audit Committee update. Peter Farrow, please.
Thank you, Chair. This is the roughly quarterly update that SIPFA provide for public sector audit committees to help keep them aware of what the hot topics are out there at this point in time, and for them to flag courses and webinars that they're offering to audit committee members if they feel they would benefit from attending. And in each edition they tend to focus upon one or two issues, and the latest issue focuses upon two areas we've already really covered earlier on the agenda. The first one is around the Redmond review, and obviously the outcome of Sir Tony Redmond's review and the responses and consultation to the responses that is now taking place, which Mark Stocks from Grant Thornton covered at the start of the agenda. And the second one is on the impact of COVID-19 on local authority internal audit teams and how that may impact upon the sort of ability to give an head of audit annual opinion. And again, I've covered that in the previous agenda item, where there has obviously been an impact, but it's not as significant as it could have been. And we feel that we can sort of pick up and get to a point in time where we'll have done sufficient work to be able to give an opinion at the end of the year. So I didn't intend to spend any more time on that, because I think we've covered it through the meeting, but obviously we'll try and answer any questions the committee may have.
Indeed, thank you, Peter. Yes, we have covered quite a bit of it previously, but does anyone have any comments or questions specifically on anything that's in the SIPFA update? No, thank you very much indeed. That is duly noted. And moving on now to our final agenda item, the strategic risk register, the coronavirus and Brexit risk register, as it has become, and members will be accustomed to having Narinda Fagura usually here to present that, and I speak, I think, for all officers and members of the committee in wishing her a fast and speedy recovery. She's currently battling with the terrible coronavirus, and we wish her and her family members all the very best during what is a tough time. But let's hand over to Peter Farrows for this, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and apologies to the committee as you've got a poor substitute tonight, because obviously Narinda is really embedded in the risk management process and can bring it to life probably a lot better than I can. But what I will do is I'll give you a summary and some of the background to some of the issues in there. At the moment, historically we had a strategic risk register. Obviously at the outset of the pandemic, ourselves, like a number of authorities, felt that because of the issues and the risks around COVID, that it necessitated the need to develop a separate standalone risk register, and that's a model that we've stuck with for now. It may be that at some stage in the future, possibly in the near future, that as those risks start to merge and it almost becomes the new normal, that we may refer back to one register that encapsulates all of those risks. But for now, we've got two risk registers. And as an added complexity to the COVID risk register, because of obviously the recent Brexit from Europe, that it was felt that some of the issues around Brexit, in particular the Council's recovery plan, and how that may impact upon the economic impact of Sandwell and the UK, that we would combine the Brexit risks, sort of integrate them into the COVID risks as well. So you've got a Brexit and you've got a COVID and Brexit risk register and the strategic risk register today. So just starting on the Brexit COVID risk register, as members will see, there are 4 red risks contained within the register, along with a smattering of amber risk. The 4 red risks, the first one is around budgetary implications. Now the council is pretty confident that it's got the funding to meet the requirements of dealing with the pandemic for the current year, i.e. 2021. There's been, a lot of government funding that we've been able to tap into and use. However, going forward, 21-22 onwards, depending on how long the pandemic is with us and how that impacts upon the borough, there's still that uncertainty about what funding we will get and if that will be sufficient to meet the demand. Hence why that's a red risk, not necessarily for the short term, but for the medium term. The economic impact upon Sandwell, again, is likely to be great as we start to recover, hence great in large, not in a great way as such. So that is also a red risk. There's risk to the health of both residents and businesses. Now this risk has been separated out because initially it included the workforce at Sandwell, but because there are quite a few mitigating factors now in place for the workforce, and for example we're all working, or the majority of officers are working remotely and at home, and there are support mechanisms in place, the risk to health for the workforce is amber, but the risk to the health of the residents and the businesses in Sandwell remains as red, particularly because of the high prevalence of COVID across the borough, hence why that's a red risk. And the last red risk on this register is the supply chain resilience. Again, really that reflects the fragility of the care market at the moment and our almost dependency upon that being able to cope with the situation that we find ourselves in. So in this register, as in the strategic risk register, we do provide a lot of detailed update in the comment section at the right hand side of the table, which we work with the risk owners and we take the report through the leadership team and share it with the leader and the cabinet member for core resources. So they're all aware of how the council is mitigating those risks, and we're sort of flagging that this evening to the committee here that there's 4 red risks. The council's doing the best it can to manage them in these uncertain times. On the strategic risk register, which is a more traditional risk register that comes to the committee and contains the sort of longer standing risks that you would expect to see on such a register, there are 13 risks in total. 7 are red and 6 are amber. Now the red risks, again, some of those have been on the register for quite some time, and members may note that the movement on all of the risks, all 13, has remained as was. None have gone up, or none have unfortunately been able to be brought down. And those 7 red risks, the first one is around children's social care and obviously the arrangements that we have with the Children's Trust. The second one is on the demand for children's social care. There's GDPR, which is an issue that this committee has focused upon in the past. The ongoing funding and financial position for the council. While we've got a balanced budget for 21-22, you know, the future, the longer term future is unclear because we just don't know what government funding we're going to receive. Cyber security. I talked about bank mandate fraud earlier on the agenda, and the risk of cyber security remains high, although our IT function is doing all it can to make sure that it mitigates that, but it does remain a red risk. The Better Care Fund and the long-term funding of adult social care remains a national issue, and as well as just for ourselves locally, hence why that's a red risk. And the business management system at the moment, Sandwell, is going through an exercise where it's updating its key financial system, and again there's a risk there that if we don't get that in place, up and running, you know, the impact that that could have on our ability to, for example, you know, maintain the financial records across the borough. But again, there are processes in place to try and make sure that that is achieved. Now, out of those 7 risks, 3 are really as a direct result, I guess, of government funding. So while we can do what we can to try and mitigate those risks, our hands would be tied in at least 3 of those areas, and they're obviously around children's social care, the funding, financial position of the council, and the funding for audits for adult services going forward. So, like I say, while we have a number of mitigating factors around those, really our ability to manage those is restricted by the need for sufficient funding or steer from the national government. So hopefully that gives you a fair reflection of the risks that we face within Sandwell, both on the COVID front and on the more traditional strategic front. I will try and answer any questions that you do have, but if I don't have the answers because I'm sort of a short notice stand-in for Narinda, I'm more than happy to go away and speak to the risk owners and directors and try and get a more detailed response to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Mr. Ager, please.
Well, thank you, Chair. To comment more than anything else, I think when I read these reports, I feel rather like an uneasy conjurer with too many balls in the air. You can drop any one of these red risks and you're in terrible trouble. I do think it would be a good thing when we can get these lists together, because it's actually very difficult to comprehend 11 red risks, I find, as a committee member. That's really a comment, nothing more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ager. Steph, who do we have next, please?
Mr. Doyle.
Mr. Doyle, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for standing in, Peter. I suppose, given the news with a number of councils thinking about Section 114s, I know you said that we've got funding for this year. But what stage do we think that we're going to have better clarity as to exactly how the sort of the finances of the council are going to be impacted by the pandemic in the sort of realms of worst case, best case, realistic case?
Rebecca, I'm not sure if you may be able to give a better position on that. I'm guessing that the key phrase is the future is uncertain, but I'm not sure if there's anything you feel you could add, Rebecca, to that. Sorry to call you in.
Yeah, that's fine. Through you, Chair. The difficulty that we've got at the moment is that, again, the government have only provided a 1-year finance settlement. So we know what our budget position is for the current year. It looks like the COVID grants that have been allocated to us during the current year are sufficient to address the immediate budget pressures that we're experiencing. We do have a budget shortfall next year, which we're able to cover from one-off resources. But then after that, as Pete said, really, that there's so much uncertainty, both in terms of what the government are likely to do in terms of funding, in terms of the longer term impact of COVID as well, because we are a 100% business rights retention council. So any any effect on businesses that fail has a massive impact on us and our business rates collection. So yeah, it is really difficult at the moment to be able to project forwards. We are working as a budget board, which is the leadership team, looking at what we think the position looks like across the next 3 years. But that may change once we know more detail on the government funding for future years. So it's a bit difficult to answer the question, but we will obviously keep you up to date as and when we can.
No, thanks for that. No, I appreciate that it's uncertain. It's just trying to understand the magnitude. So what I'm hearing is that the next financial year is okay. After that, we just don't have any clarity, and it might be okay or not. Yeah,
I think we're okay, as you say, for this year and next year we're okay. And at the moment, I don't think we would be anywhere near 114 territory even in the future years. I think the big concern really is around some of the changes that the government are planning to make in terms of the funding system, which have been delayed because of COVID, because that could have a significant impact on our funding. And also the question of whether or not they will want to try and recoup some of the money that they've allocated out for COVID. So yeah, it's at the moment we're sort of assuming a standstill position in terms of government funding, but that could obviously change.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Rebecca, Peter, and Mr. Doyle. And it's a personal comment, but I think the government should really recognise how much local councils and its staff have done for local communities during this unprecedented times. They said to us at the beginning of the pandemic, spend and no council will be left out of pocket. And I think it's important the government are true to their word on that, because we do need some certainty moving forward, because people are going to need local authorities and the support that we provide more than ever before coming out of this pandemic, quite frankly. Steph, who do we have next, please?
Chair, there are no hands up at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed. So I take it that there's no further questions or comments on this item. Before I conclude the meeting, can I thank everyone for attending, all the elected members, the officers who have supported us. And again, I know I've mentioned it numerous times throughout this meeting, but I think it's important to thank all the over 4,000 staff of the council who have done a huge amount during this time. And I'm sure I speak for all the members of the committee and the council, in fact, putting our appreciation on the record for them. They are challenging times, as we've heard today, but no doubt together providing the type of assurances that this committee has always done will continue to be able to navigate this very difficult period. Thank you all very much, and I conclude the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.